Okay, so we're going to start talking about philosophy of mind today. This is really the question of where does consciousness come from? Or at least that is one of the questions. We might need to start, though, with what consciousness actually is. Consciousness has a very specific meaning in philosophy. We tend to mean by consciousness this word qualia. Qualia is what we call subjective experience. So I want to explore what that word means and what my explanation of that word means, because I think we'll then be off to a much stronger start. If you think of your brain a little bit like, well, 3 pounds of flesh that has never seen the outside world, what has seen the outside world? Not your brain, but your senses, right? Your senses receive information in here and then they feed it to your brain, and your brain produces images. Those images that you see around you, the thing you're watching right now, the tutorial you're watching, the room you're watching it in, the heat of the room, the sounds, the smell, all of that is just in your mind. It's just a kind of 4D cinema, to use David Chalmers' term. It is an image alone and nothing more. That image is qualia. It's subjective, that image that you see, because only you have it. Only you can really understand it properly. It's not like an objective fact. If we take an objective fact like C fiber stimulation, which is a fiber that connects to your brain and produces pain. Well, the C fiber stimulation itself can be measured. It's an objective fact. The subjective experience of pain, that's the qualia. That's the thing that can't be kind of transmitted. Where does it come from, this qualiaic experience, this consciousness? That produces the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem can be summed up with this. What is the relationship between the brain and the mind? I've drawn the mind as some sort of cloud because I didn't know what I mean. How would you draw a mind exactly? I don't know. I don't know why I'm putting it in that accusatorial tone. You definitely didn't do anything wrong. But I may have done. How do you draw a mind? I don't know. It's either a concept or a soul. Either way, it's not a thing that can be drawn. But what I want to know, what the mind-body problem is how do the mind and the body interact? What is their relationship? Now, one way of expressing this is through Leibniz's gap. Leibniz here with the excellent hair, which may or may not be a wig. Leibniz says, look, walking into a brain, let's say, suppose you could do that, is a little bit like walking into a windmill. When you walk into a windmill, there's a whole load of things in here, right? Those things are cogs. They are cogs that move around and are connected to each other. They are physical objects. They are the facts. A bit like in brain terms, like C fiber stimulation, right? They are things that you can understand. Well, Leibniz says, I can't see the thoughts. Where are the thoughts? Where is the mind? If that is produced by the brain too, then where is it? The connection, he says, between the mind and the brain is a bit like that. If the brain is a set of objective facts, then the subjective experience is very hard to explain indeed. Where does this rather unique thing come from? Atoms that make up your brain are not conscious, just like cogs in a windmill aren't conscious. So how can unconscious stuff produce conscious stuff? That is the problem. sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. And we're going to look broadly at two kinds of solutions to this. One is dualism over here. Dualism says that there are two substances, there are two things. Okay, so one is the mind and one is the body. And they are distinct things. The body is that kind of set of objective facts. It's the windmill over here. And then the mind, well, the mind is where qualia exists. It is the subjective experience or rational self as well. Whereas on the other hand, we have materialism, and materialism says there is only one substance. And that, of course, is the body. Now, that leaves us open to the problem of where qualia comes from, but it is a lot simpler than saying there are two substances. So I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour now of a few theories in dualism and a few theories in materialism. We're not going to spend long on any of them because we're going to spend loads of time on them in other tutorials. Let's go through a few dualist theories, because historically, really, dualism kind of came first. One of which, well, let's start with Plato over here. So Plato says that the soul, which is this thing here, is non-physical, which doesn't mean, by the way, that it doesn't exist. It's rather that it doesn't have it's not composed of physical stuff. It is rational, and it is eternal. It exists forever. And this soul is also, quite importantly, trapped in the body. So Plato thinks that the soul is the part that's experienced the realm of the forms, his special non-physical eternal realm of real knowledge, and then it's come down and it's been trapped in the body and become kind of body drunk and forgotten everything. So that's Plato's idea of dualism. Descartes' idea comes much later. After Plato, the Christian church kind of took up this idea of Platonic dualism, and that's where we get the soul in Christianity from, really. As the Christian era came to an end, Descartes, who, by the way, was a Christian but came much later, was talking in the Enlightenment period. And he thought that I could actually prove the existence of the soul. He called it, by the way, the mind. And he said, cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum, which is Latin. Cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. He thought that I don't know whether the body exists definitely, like it probably does, right? But I could be in a dream. I could be tricked into thinking these things. They could be false. But I know that my mind exists definitely. Because whenever I'm thinking, I am existing. The mind, for Descartes, is just this rational thing, this non-physical, rational substance that then interacts with the brain. So those are some dualist theories. Let's move over to materialism now, and we'll start with something that isn't a materialist theory, but, I mean, broadly, Aristotle kind of gives us a materialist theory. He thinks that the soul is radically different to Plato, his teacher's idea. He thinks that the soul is just animation. basically behavior. If you think of a body, for instance, a dead body is distinct from an alive body in as much as the alive body moves around and the dead body doesn't. He thinks that having a soul is just behaving in a particular way. And then there are different levels of souls. The vegetative soul, which is kind of the soul of plants and so on, that just kind of and grow and things. And then you have the appetitive soul, which is the soul of animals. And then finally you have the intellectual soul. And that's why I'm saying he's not really a materialist, because the intellectual soul is possibly non-physical in nature. But we'll get to that later. There are, zooming very far forward, past Descartes onto the modern era of the 20th century, two materialist theories that I want to very briefly talk about. One is behaviorism. And behaviorism says, well, all of this qualia stuff, I don't know whether you have it. I can't see it. And if I'm going to be a true scientist about this, I'm not going to take this stuff literally because I cannot see it. Instead, I wonder, I'm just going to get rid of that entirely, having just drawn it. I wonder whether I could explain all of your behavior, all of your consciousness, through your behavior, through looking at the inputs, so things that happen to you, and the outputs. In other words, I could describe consciousness through behavioral terms alone. That's behaviorism. A slightly more modern development is something called functionalism. Functionalism came about after the advent of the computer. And functionalism said, well, yes, there are inputs and there are outputs. So there is stuff that happens to you and stuff that you do. But in the middle is not this blank space, but rather a set of functions, a set of things that happen, mental states that happen on the inputs to produce the outputs. And those things, those functions, are the behavior of consciousness. Now, functionalism thinks, that just like a computer produces a program. Well, let me just explain that a bit more. The program you're watching right now, right, the tutorial is, to you and me, a tutorial. We are talking to each other. That's the whole point of this. That essentially you are being taught one-on-one, but that's what you feel like you're doing over here, the program. But what you're really doing is you're just sat with a kind of metal box that's sending electrical signals. That's all it really is. But we don't think of it in those terms. We think of it in program terms. Well, in the same way, you might have a brain, right? And that brain is just a piece of flesh. But it also produces, or in some way is, consciousness. Now, the consciousness isn't really different from the brain, but we think of it as different. One of the really interesting things, by the way, just in the last minute or so of this tutorial about functionalism, is it says, well, of course, if this kind of hardware can produce or make real consciousness, then why can't that bit of hardware also do it? Very interesting indeed. So those are some answers to the question of consciousness. Dualism, that there are two substances, mind and body, and materialism, that there's only one substance.